Thank you,
MP Jackson, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to say a few words. And in general, a decrease in any kind of tax is certainly something that is supported on this side, but I would like to just share a few comments. I'm going to begin. At first, Mr. Speaker, I wanted to sort of talk about how much the taxi industry in particular means to the history and legacy of Bermuda. And I wanted to focus on the fact that the taxi industry has provided and has certainly demonstrated during the pandemic that they are an essential service for Bermuda. They're very, very important and significant to our public service industry. And making the first immediate cut into this payroll tax confuses me, because if a government really cares about the integrity of this industry, I just don't understand why there's so much arbitration. The minister just mentioned in his brief that this is an age-old payroll tax. I personally don't even understand why it's called a payroll tax, because the tax is on a vehicle and not on individual people who are making an earning. So there doesn't seem to make any rhyme or reason between that. Now, it may be just something as simple as semantics. Either change the name of this payroll tax for taxi drivers and minibuses, or else can sit down and consider what exactly is a payroll tax for the public service industry. But that's up to government to make that decision. But what really upsets me, Mr. Speaker, is that the minister sits over there talking about how the previous governments have had this payroll tax and they charged $3,000 a year. Well, first of all, the taxi drivers may have been making more money back in those days, and therefore the $3,000 would be relative. They may now be paying less because they're not earning enough, but we'll leave that to the side, Mr. Speaker. But the worst part that really bothers me, and I've brought this up in the House before, Mr. Speaker, I do not understand why a Labor government continues to just copy these age-old laws, knowing that they're not relevant. They've got the wrong name, they're pinpointing the wrong thing, but yet they just can, instead of saying, okay, we're going to sit down and really figure this out, which I've been asking for years, figure it out. Look, take a big, long, comprehensive review of the public service vehicle industry and try to make it right. But instead, in this situation, all they've done is they've taken some, I don't even understand what this payroll tax on a vehicle is all about, and just reduced it, arbitrarily reduced it. Well, you know what? And I stand on my own. My colleagues in the OBA may not agree with me, but just do away with the payroll tax for taxis altogether. Why even have it? It doesn't apply to payroll. And it's something that the UBP or somebody else came up with 50 years ago, and they're still hanging on to it. And it makes no sense, except for politics, because they get to say, oh, we're reducing a price. So we're going to leave that alone, park it to the side. Mr. Speaker, the taxi drivers were told in February of 2024 that this decrease in payroll tax was coming. The PLP, Minister of Transport, put it on the gov.bm. I think there's even a video to go with it, talking about how this payroll tax was going to be reduced from $1,000 down to $600. Crickets. We had the budget. We had the budget debate. We had all the legislation that was passed around the budget debate. We're now into March. Crickets, Mr. Speaker. And then September rolls around, which is the time when the taxi drivers start to renew their license, which might be a better term for this payroll tax. They get down to TCD and they have their $600 in their hand based on the government.bm big press release and published programs and cameras in action. And TCD said, absolutely not. No one has said a thing about reducing our payroll tax for taxis. So the taxi drivers going down there with the written expectation that there would be $600 charge for the payroll tax for September 1st of October deadline 2024, and they were told no, pay $1,000. So in actual fact, they have not only misled the taxi industry, but then they've also delayed the payment of this beautiful increase that, you know, is getting so much attention. So, Mr. Speaker, the taxi industry has now paid the $1,000, even though they were told in February of 2024 that there would be a decrease. In September of 2024, they all paid the $1,000. And now, Mr. Speaker, they're not going to get to realize that $400 reduction until next September, almost a year from now, Mr. Speaker. 9, 10 months the taxi industry is going to have to wait to realize this reduction. And to be honest with you, Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure that the industry is going to be able to afford the $600 when we get to October of 2025. Now, Mr. Speaker, this industry, aside from the fact that this is a significant historical and legacy industry for our country, and in particular, the service that they provide to the tourism industry, which has grown, by the way, Mr. Speaker, to some 800,000 projected for 2025. 800,000 visitors. That may just be on cruise ships. But, Mr. Speaker, they have had a limit on taxi permits since 1970, and this Labor government has done nothing to review that idea. And because of that 600, since 1970, there are so many taxis that are parked up somewhere, not being used, whether they're caught up in probate from the death of a family member, whether they're caught up in any other mechanical issues that haven't been resolved. The point I'm making, Mr. Speaker, is there are not enough taxis on this island, and the government has done absolutely nothing to address it. They may have 225 minibuses out there, but they're unregulated, Mr. Speaker. They're not a part of any kind of guideline. So they're probably being underutilized, and no one is asking them, how can we utilize these minibuses better? So, Mr. Speaker, we're in a hot mess. And you know what really bothers me? This is an industry for our Black, disenfranchised Bermudian males. The government has said that over and over again, because I've been sitting in this chair since the beginning. Mr. Speaker, this is an entrepreneurial opportunity for many, many people in Bermuda. And no one is doing anything to nurture it. They've been neglected. And Mr. Speaker, this is the one place where a human being, a Bermudian, can get behind the wheel of a car and have some dignity and have some entrepreneurial, independent ownership. And we've done nothing to address it. This is an opportunity, and we know, Mr. Speaker, you're from the generation of folks that drove taxi drivers, and were more than happy to say that they had sent their children to private schools, that they had houses, apartments, living well. This was a major, you could make your own money. And none of that exists like it did from yesterday, today. None of it. There are taxi drivers out there required by law to drive their taxi for 16 hours a day. They can't take a break. They're supposed to take a 24-hour break once a week. They can't take that break because they've got to go out there and make the money, and they're not earning enough. And there's so much neglect from this government as far as organizing, setting policy, being actively involved.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order.
Hate to interrupt the wonderful honorable member. She was on, a roll. However, I would just like to point out to the honorable member that she is misleading the House and is factually incorrect. The law does not require any taxi driver to drive a vehicle for 16 hours a day. It requires a public service vehicle to be on the road for 16 hours a day. That is the law. She should make sure she corrects it before the view is that people are supposed to be driving 16 hours a day.
Fine, Hagan.
If it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker.
The point was, let me just clear up so we don't go back and forth. The point was that the vehicle is regulated for 16 hours, not the driver.
Accepted, accepted, accepted. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The vehicle must be on the road for 16 hours, but we're not necessarily enforcing or supervising or checking in on who's driving the vehicle for the 16 hours. And I'll leave it at that. But it brings me to another thought, Mr. Speaker. If a vehicle is on the road mandatory for 16 hours a day, I'm going to use that as my starting point. Where is the data? Where is the transport ministry collecting the data so that they know when a taxi is on the road, who's driving it, how many hours it's been driven? Because, Mr. Speaker, I don't know if you remember, it was just a small little parliamentary question that I submitted some time ago asking about the reports from the dispatch companies that service the work to the taxi drivers. And I happened to have been caught up in an email trail that actually was the Ministry of Transport reaching out. This is after I have submitted my parliamentary question. Government, I happen to have been copied in on the email where government went out and asked the dispatch for the reports. So what I'm saying, Mr. Speaker, is I don't believe anybody has been collecting any data on any taxi driver activity in Bermuda for some time, because that's a 6-month report. So we've got, I don't even know what dispatch we have, because I'm not quite sure how to define hitch. And, you know, I don't know. And then we've got Bermuda Island, and they submit their reports with their data after they're asked, but not proactively, because nobody's doing anything with that data. So, Mr. Speaker, my questions to the minister are this. I wrote some of them down. Mr. Speaker, this is all about the data. We all are asking, I'm asking, why are we still having this payroll tax, just like a lump sum of the 1,000 reduced to 600? And that, to me, the introduction of the minibus tax is just offsetting the taxi. So there really isn't any loss to government whatsoever, but the minibuses now have to pay a tax in order to complement or supplement or tally up, so that government still gets their money, but now it's shared between the taxi operators and the minibus operators. So that to me sounds a little on the, I'll leave it at that. So regarding data, we would like to know, what data is transport collecting to derive this payroll tax structure? We'd also like to know screen freeze. Not so we'd also like to know whether the government is collecting the dispatch data, the 6-month data, and where that data is being kept and how it is being formulated to help figure out the payroll tax. Does the government base tax on taxi by miles, hours driven, amounts earned? Whatever happens to the data that's supposed to come out of the analog meters once a year that shows the total sum of earnings and other statistics that come from the analog meters. Where has that data gone? Does TCD even still do that? And how are they using the data that is collected, whether it's from the meters, whether it's from the dispatch companies, for calculating any kind of tax? And it feels very awkward to say payroll tax, because that just doesn't seem to match with the vehicle, the meter, and the data from dispatch around the activities of the actual taxi driver and the work that they're doing.
MP, if you don't mind, do you have much more of your presentation? Because we are 12:30. Y'all want a good roll. I don't want to shut you down, but would you want to come back after lunch? Or
you know what? I'm gonna can I leave it there and come back after lunch?
Sure.
And then, yep. Thank
Okay.
you.
All right, Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that the Honorable House do now adjourn for lunch until 2 p.m.
Members, are there any objections to that? There are none. The House now stands adjourned until 2 p.m. Good afternoon, members. Trust everyone had a nice break. Now we're ready to resume for the afternoon sitting. And I believe that MP Jackson was still on her feet. We'll start there. The House is now in session. MP Jackson, you can resume.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just have a few questions before we go into committee. And I'd like to ask the minister, actually, how is the government, the Ministry of Transport, actually calculating a payroll tax on a vehicle? Is it that you're looking at the miles that the car has been driven? Are you looking at the hours that the meter has been running? Are you looking at the earnings of the driver and the operator and the owner? If the minister might be able to give us a little information on that. I'd also like to ask, why is the payroll tax actually attached to a vehicle? And the reason why I'm asking that, Mr. Speaker, is because if the tax is on the vehicle, it seems to me almost counterproductive, because these vehicles then have to work in an environment that is not conducive to them. So if you're taxing the vehicle and the vehicle is riding on bad roads, there's no enforcement at the beaches to assist with the orderly movement of cruise passengers in particular back to the ports. And if we aren't able to provide the services, we just wonder why the vehicle is being taxed when there is actually no government support to help keep their vehicles in good order. Mr. Speaker, my other question is, where is this payroll tax going? There are so many more opportunities, especially for the minibuses. And without the Ministry of Transport taking a look at the environment and saying, well, you know, we're going to tax you tax your vehicle, but these are all of the other opportunities that you could use your vehicle to earn money. And it's not my job as the opposition to figure out what those things might be. But, you know, just as an example, having a minibus service in some of our secondary road neighborhoods, and Spanish Point seems to be like one of the big ones for me, but other opportunities that may be available for the public service vehicles beside the apply for hire and other services that are already regulated. Mr. Speaker, I've stayed away from the actual origin of payroll tax, because when I have the conversations with taxi drivers, and some of them have been so kind as to actually provide the calculation for me, it's pretty evident that many of the operators of the vehicles are not earning a minimum wage. If you calculate what they earn, yes, you know, I've heard people say, oh, we're making all this money over Cup Match Holiday, and we make all this money here, and we make all this money there. But that's for a couple of weeks, maybe a month or two, maybe even 3 months. But there are 12 months in the year, Mr. Speaker. And these drivers, and as the Premier had mentioned earlier, the vehicle has to be on the road for 16 hours a day. If a human being, one person, should not be driving for 16 hours a day, which was what was kind of alluded to in the clarification, then a taxi driver may only be in their cab for 8, maybe 10 hours a day. And we all know the truth, Mr. Speaker, that you can spend an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours sitting in a taxi, sitting in a minibus, waiting for your fare. So that 8 hours is not a money-earning fountain of cash for the full 8 hours. And if you calculate, if the Ministry of Transport were to sit down and really calculate, like just look at the meter, look at the miles, look at the hours, I would bet that many, 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 many of the operators for driving taxis and minibuses are not earning the minimum wage. And the only way that they could really get into trying to even apply or be a part of the minimum wage, as I understand it, the operators of these public service vehicles would probably have to get involved as independent contractors. And right now, taxis are not part of independent contractors. Now, independent contractors, they can be anyone. It could be people in the trades and construction industry. It could be entrepreneurs in the retail business, etc. They have guidelines, Mr. Speaker, and the taxi drivers are not included in those guidelines, which makes it even more difficult or...
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. Can I just call attention to order in regards to the germaneness of this conversation? I mean, I know we're going to principles, but now we've struggled into minimum wage earning for taxi drivers applicable under a completely different set of laws. And I must ask if the honorable member would constrain her comments to the bill being discussed, or if you may so direct, or if the honorable member may wish to offer any solution to any of the litany of things of which she's mentioned at this time. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. And, of course...
Keep it in frame of today's matter.
Well,
that's all.
Mr. Speaker, the difficulty...
I'm sure you're skilled enough to be able to do that.
The difficulty with this, Mr. Speaker, is that this particular bill is titled payroll tax. So if nobody's making any money anyway in the public service vehicle industry, and if you're taxing a vehicle and calling
Point
it
of order,
payroll
Mr. Speaker.
tax, it
Point
applies.
of order, Mr. Speaker.
Order.
The honorable member is clearly misleading the House. She just got up and said that nobody is making any money in the public service vehicle industry. Meanwhile, at the same points in time, she commented on the record number of cruise arrivals, air arrivals, and statistics, which point to exactly the opposite.
Member?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Be mindful of your... Don't contradict
I'm
yourself.
not going to get into it because that's seasonal, and these folks live here 365 days of the year. So that's another debate for another day, Mr. Speaker. So I'm not going to be chased down that road. Thank you. But Mr. Speaker, before I leave, take my seat, I do want to mention some suggestions. The public service vehicle operators would like to have a seat at the table. They would like to be a member of the Public Service Vehicle Licensing Board and have some input into how the management and the development of policies and enforcement are conducted and created within the Ministry of Transport. I also believe that even though it's secondary, that if the complaints around public service vehicles were given a little more credence and enforcement and policy were created around that, we believe that there would be some improvements and efficiencies that could be provided. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I will take my seat, but I definitely feel that that this particular payroll tax amendment is not necessarily attached to payroll tax, and it could be as simple as changing a name or changing the function of the money that is raised. Would be in the best interest. And Mr. Speaker, I support a reduction in this payroll tax. I support the reduction in the payroll tax. I actually support doing away with this tax because to me it makes no sense. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, MP Jackson.